All right, today we're going to unbox, assemble, and test out this FiveStar outdoor TV antenna. Let's take a look at some of these claims on the box here. 1080 4K HD FM VHF UHF. You can pick those up with any TV antenna. There's nothing special about that. The wrenches, maybe that means an easy assembly. We'll find out. Intelligent gain and 4G LTE. I don't know what that's referring to. There's no amplifier or filter included with this antenna. So it might be that this antenna design just naturally filters out those 4G LTE signals just by virtue of its design. Those frequencies are just above the UHF TV band anyways, and this antenna might naturally just roll those off. And pay no attention to this 200-mile range claim. The kit that I bought came with all this stuff too: mounting arm and bracket, hardware, even some roof sealant. But word to the wise, if you don't know what you're doing, please hire someone that does if you're going to put this antenna on your roof. Also came with some coax staples, zip ties, a splitter which is power passing, but I wouldn't go splitting the signal 4 ways with this antenna with a passive splitter like this, because you're probably going to have lots of signal breakup and loose channels. You might want to use a powered splitter for that. It also came with a roll of coaxial cable. I think there's 40 feet here, and it's actually a decent size thickness. It is RG6. It's got a weather boot, but I wouldn't recommend using this outside because this white coaxial cable does not have the correct kind of UV resistance, so that's really best used only indoors. If you're going to mount this outside, use some black UV resistant coaxial cable. Assembly went pretty fast. Everything goes together with carriage bolts and wing nuts. The only tool I had to use was a screwdriver and a pair of pliers to back off the bolts for these phasing lines so I can turn them around without breaking something to connect them to the active elements. Other than that, it went smooth and easy. Size-wise, this antenna is 4 feet long and the widest elements are 29 inches at the back. So that makes this a small to medium outdoor antenna. Now, besides the quick assembly, I also like the fact that this antenna is made of mostly metal. Even the brackets that join the segments together are made of metal. Very little plastic overall, except where necessary to insulate those active elements from touching the main boom. And here's that FiveStar antenna mounted on a mast about 17 feet in the air and pointed in the direction of my local broadcast towers. A little bit of background about my reception situation. I'm about 7 miles from the broadcast towers through the air, and all of the channels in my area transmit on the VHF band on RF channels 2, 4, and 9. So today I will verify the VHF performance of this antenna. Checking the signal strength, RF channel 2 at the bottom of the low VHF band had a decent signal in the mid to high 60s and didn't bounce around too much, only fluctuated by a couple of percent. That's pretty good for a channel that usually requires longer elements to be received. RF channel 4 also had a pretty stable signal in the low 60s. RF channel 9 hung around the 80s for the most part, although it did bounce around a bit, dipping into the high 70s and up into the low 90s. So not too bad. So this antenna did a good job on RF channels 2, 4, and 9 on the VHF band in my area. One of the big reasons is because of these 2 long elements on the back of the antenna. Those are the VHF elements, and you can see they're much longer than the other elements on this antenna, and they're both active elements. You can see they're tied together with these metal phasing lines that form an X. That means that they're both directly connected to the coaxial cable. And with 2 elements collecting signal and sending those signals to the coaxial cable, you're going to get better gain on this particular TV band, VHF. I think this part of the antenna is well designed. Now, as for all of the other smaller elements, those are for UHF, and that is another matter entirely. Unfortunately, I can't verify the UHF performance of this antenna because I don't have any UHF stations broadcasting in this area. But looking at the front part of this antenna, these front directors here are really close together. They're about 3 inches apart, and they get progressively closer and closer until they come to this folded dipole here, this oval-shaped element. That is the main active element for the UHF TV band. And then behind that are these angled reflectors. They're all very small. Everything's really close together. This is definitely not designed for the current US TV frequency spectrum used for UHF, which is channels 14 through 36. This really looks like it's designed for the old UHF TV frequency spectrum, which covered all the way up to channel 69. As TV channels go up in frequency, the wavelengths become smaller, and therefore you can use an antenna with smaller elements. But as TV channels go down in frequency, the wavelengths become bigger, therefore the elements need to be bigger. That's why these VHF elements are so much longer. The wavelengths are much longer than the UHF channels. And further to that, as the frequencies get lower and the wavelengths get longer, the spacing between the elements gets further apart, hence the difference in spacing between these back VHF elements and the much closer spacing here in the front on the UHF elements. But the problem is that this antenna is made for receiving UHF TV channels, which are no longer even used in the US. And looking back at that 4G LTE badge that's on the box, the design of this antenna would probably make it more susceptible to 5G, 4G, or LTE cell phone interference, especially considering that those cell phone signals now occupy the same frequencies as the former UHF TV channels 38 to 69 used to be on. I got a feeling this antenna was designed to be used in many different places in the world, some of which the UHF TV frequency spectrum probably goes all the way up to channel 69. That probably explains why the front elements are so small and squished together. The current US TV frequency spectrum for UHF only goes up to channel 36. And being that those are on the lower part of the frequency spectrum, those signals are going to be carried by longer wavelengths, which require larger elements. This antenna made by Televes has been specially designed to receive the current TV frequency spectrum used on the UHF band, namely RF channels 14 through 36 in the United States. And you can tell that it's been redesigned because the spacing between these directors is much larger to pick up those longer wavelengths. There's also a much larger active element here, these boomerang looking elements here. And there's also much bigger rear reflectors as well. So that's going to do a much better job picking up channels 14 through 36, which are lower on the frequency spectrum and use much longer wavelengths than the old frequency spectrum that went all the way up to channel 69. To be clear, I would expect this antenna to pick up strong UHF TV broadcasts, but I wouldn't expect much gain on any weak or distant signals. If you're looking to improve VHF TV reception, namely on channels 7 through 13 in a city or suburban reception area, then this antenna from FiveStar will probably fit the bill for that. However, if you're looking for an antenna that gives good gain on the UHF TV band, especially channels 14 through 36, which is the current TV frequency spectrum used in the US for UHF television channels, and realistically, that's where most broadcast channels are nowadays, then you're going to want to find a different antenna. This one is just simply not designed correctly to give good gain on UHF, especially weak or distant stations. With the tight spacing between these directors and the small active element and reflectors, this is built for the old UHF frequency spectrum all the way up to channel 69, most of which is no longer used in North America. So you're going to want to look for an antenna that has much wider spacing between the front directors, a much bigger active element, and larger rear reflectors as well.